I unlocked my phone when my mind was almost completely drained after a long day. It was that kind of exhaustion that makes you do everything on autopilot, check your email, skim a few messages, then tell yourself tomorrow, you'll pull yourself together and do better. A family group chat popped up on my screen, one I thought I'd known about forever, with a name so harmless it didn't spark even a flicker of caution. I actually assumed someone had sent a recipe again, a picture of one of the little kids, or some minor story just to keep up the feeling that home was still home. Then I tapped it. The first thing that caught my eye was a row of clapping emojis. Right underneath, Claire Reed had written, "So Harper lost another job. Honestly, the only thing she's ever been consistent at." There was a laughing emoji after it. Jason Moore replied almost immediately, "Don't be like that, be fair to Harper, at least she's committed to making the wrong choice every time." Someone reacted with a heart. Someone else sent a congratulatory gif, as they'd just finished watching a comedy routine. I stared at the screen so long, my vision started to blur. I reread my name, then reread every word, hoping my exhausted brain had stitched the sentence together wrong, misunderstood the context, or, worst of all, that I'd somehow opened an old conversation that belonged to someone else. But the farther I scrolled, the more my denial splintered apart. They were talking about when I lost my job in Portland. About the morning, I sat in my car for almost an hour because I couldn't make myself call anyone. About my breakup, and how I'd moved back near home with almost nothing left. Things I had told people in a broken voice, things I had treated like the most private humiliations of my life, had become content for a whole group to consume for fun. My heart started pounding so hard it hurt in my chest. My throat went dry. My hands turned cold even though the air conditioner had been off for hours. I read the messages a second time, then a third, like an idiot still hoping to find one line that would rescue the meaning of all this. But the more I read, the clearer it became that I wasn't mistaken. They had actually sat there and used my failures to entertain each other. Claire was the sharpest. She didn't need many words. Every sentence was like a thin blade, clean, precise, and meant to land exactly where it hurt. Harper always has a gift for turning every opportunity into an expensive lesson. Anyone want to guess how long she lasts this time before she calls home crying? If Harper ever becomes stable, the sun will probably start rising in the west. I could practically hear Claire's voice in my head, that silk-soft voice she used when she spoke to my face, but in that group chat it was full of delight. Jason was different. He didn't stab straight on. He performed. "We should start a betting pool. I've always said Harper has a talent for turning every decision into a disaster movie. Can somebody check whether she has anything left to collapse over?" That kind of joking was what made me sick. One person threw the stone, everyone else laughed, and my pain got broken into bite-sized pieces for them to enjoy together. But what made my scalp prickle wasn't the mockery. It was how much they knew. They knew which 3 places I had applied to and where I had been turned down. They knew about the night I called my mother with my voice catching because I'd just been rejected for another job. They knew who I'd met for coffee. They knew I had cried in my car outside a grocery store on a Friday afternoon. They even knew about the times I said I was fine when I wasn't fine at all. Those details were scattered casually through the conversation, calm and exact in a way that was terrifying. The more I read, the tighter my stomach twisted. I no longer felt like I was just being talked about behind my back. I felt like I had been watched for a long time without ever knowing it. Then, I saw Declan Davis's name. My heart dropped in a completely different way. Declan appeared less often than the others. He didn't pile on in any obvious way, but he didn't defend me either. A few short messages. A few reaction emojis. A few comments so neutral they were impossible to pin down. "Let's see what happens. She's probably doing really badly. Don't take it too far." If I read each line by itself, I could almost lie to myself and believe Declan still had some kindness left in him. But he was in the group. He had seen what they wrote. He had been present in the place where they turned my life into a joke, and he hadn't left, and he hadn't warned me. I sat there without moving, digging back through every moment when Declan had asked if I was okay, every time he texted at exactly the point when my life was falling apart. Back then, I had felt comforted. Now those memories shifted sideways, like someone had tilted the whole picture. Had he really cared, Or had he asked because he already knew I'd fallen one more time? That uncertainty kept me from being fully angry yet. I was still stunned, still hurt. But I had started to fear that underneath all these jokes, there was something uglier. I scrolled farther back through the older messages, despite the shaking in my hands. Every time the screen slid past another week, another month, another year, I found another piece of my life chopped up for their amusement. Then I saw a voice recording. It had been sent a long time ago, pinned in the middle of a thread I hadn't finished reading yet. The sender was a number I recognized instantly, someone close enough to me that I had never once imagined they would do this to me. Beneath the recording was a caption from Claire. "Now this is the best part. If this secret gets out, Harper will never be able to hold her head up again." Jason replied with a line that turned both my hands ice cold. "I told you. That girl's living inside a story she doesn't even know all of." I stared at the play button. In my mind, one thing rose immediately, the one thing I had kept buried, the thing tied to both my childhood and the part of my life I always avoided touching. I had thought that even if everyone else turned their backs on me, my family would still keep that buried as the final line they would never cross. But here, they had touched it. They had dragged it out. They were ready to turn it into the next thing they laughed at. I took a short breath and touched the recording. The instant the first voice came through, an icy chill ran straight down my spine. I turned the volume all the way down, then tapped the voice recording pinned in the group chat. At first, there was only a faint rustling sound, like someone setting a phone down on a table. Then came the clink of glasses, a short laugh, and then Samuel King's voice rang out so clearly that I had to grip the edge of the table to keep from dropping my phone. "Just let Harper mess it up again. What's the rush? If she gets too stable, what's the family supposed to talk about?" Then Claire Reed's voice followed, calm in a way that made my blood run cold, with none of the chaos of a slip of the tongue or a heated outburst. Honestly, every time Harper falls and then gets back up again, it exhausts me. I thought maybe this time she was actually doing better, but no, right back where she started. Predictable. They laughed. Not loudly, not wildly, just that thin, casual laugh of people enjoying a story they've told each other far too many times. That was what hurt the most. If they had been angry, if they had said it in some moment of lost control, maybe I could have lied to myself and believed I was hearing the ugliest version of them. But no. Their voices were steady, level, almost bored, like they were discussing what to eat over the weekend. I sat completely still, listening to my name being dropped between laughter and cold remarks, as if my life were nothing more than entertainment to make their meals feel less bland. I rewound it and played it again, like someone deliberately hurting herself just to make sure she hadn't heard wrong. The same sentence, the same voices. They didn't just laugh when I stumbled. They wanted me to fall again. My failures were no longer unfortunate in my family's eyes. They were something to look forward to, something to save and pass around like a good story. I scrolled back through the old messages. 1 week, 1 month, half a year, then farther. The farther I went, the colder my hands became. My name kept appearing with awful regularity, like a standing topic. When I changed jobs, they guessed how long I would last. When I went through a breakup, they made bets on who had left whom first. When I moved, Claire wrote one short line so cruel it almost made me stop breathing. "Harper's calling, running away, a fresh start again." Samuel reacted with a laughing emoji. Jason Moore added, "At least she's giving us new content." Some of the messages were only a few words long, but they were enough to make me feel stripped bare in front of my own family. Guess whether it's money or a man this time. If Harper stays peaceful for 3 months, the sky will probably change direction. Don't help her yet. Let's see how she spins this one. The more I read, the more the humiliation rose in me. The initial shock burned off quickly, leaving behind a deep, icy chill that ran all the way down my spine. This wasn't a few nasty moments. It was a habit, a system, a small family culture they had all helped build, one where I was the only clown on the stage who didn't know she was performing. I opened my private chat with Declan Davis and stared at it for a long time without typing. Out of everyone around me, he was the one person I had believed would never be the one pushing me down. In the end, I sent something that sounded harmless enough. "Do you know what everyone in the family says about me?" Declan saw the message quickly, but it took him a few minutes to answer. Every family says things they don't mean sometimes. I stared at that reply until my eyes started to sting. It wasn't a denial. It wasn't him telling me I had misunderstood. I typed again. So you do know. This time, he took even longer. I think there are some things you shouldn't read when you're already exhausted. I actually laughed out loud, a laugh that sounded like it belonged to someone else. If he were innocent, he would have asked what I was talking about. If he were on my side, he would have told me the truth. But Declan chose the softest path, the vaguest one, the safest one for himself. The pain inside me changed shape then. It was no longer sharp like it had been when I heard the recording. It turned heavy, sinking, like something was dragging me slowly downward. I had always thought that if the whole family turned their backs on me, Declan would at least be decent enough not to make me dig through this pile of lies by myself. I went back to the group member list and stopped at a name that made me freeze. Natalie Wright. My grandmother had once been in this group. But when I opened the history, there was almost nothing from her. No encouragement, no emojis, not a single message like the others. Suddenly, her silence felt strange. Had she seen everything and left on her own? Or had they pushed her out after she saw something she was never supposed to see? I kept scrolling, following the timeline to the exact week I lost my promotion, the day I had spent months blaming myself for because I believed I had made a mistake in my final report. In the middle of the old messages, a gray line appeared like a splinter in my eye. Lillian Taylor unsent a message. I went completely still. Lillian was one of the quietest people in the group, almost invisible beside the louder names, so I had never paid much attention to her. But that was exactly why that unsent message felt so terrifying. I stared at the timestamp. It had been sent on the very morning I was called into human resources. A thought moved through my mind, slowly, coldly, until goosebumps rose along my arms. Maybe one of the biggest failures of my life had never been an accident. I sat there for almost an hour, just rereading those old messages, as if staring at them long enough, they might somehow turn into an explanation that hurt less. But they didn't. The more I read, the more a strange feeling rose in me. It wasn't the original shock anymore. It was something colder, sharper. I started remembering the times I had failed, the chances I had lost, the nights I had locked myself in my room and decided it had to be because I was clumsy, weak, not good enough. Back then, I punished myself more harshly than anyone else ever did. And now, piecing everything back together, I could finally see that some things had never fallen on me by accident. The biggest promotion opportunity I ever had slipped through my hands almost 2 years ago. I had made it to the final round for a position I had wanted for 3 years. I had prepared so thoroughly that I knew every number in the report, every departmental target, every hard question my supervisors might throw at me. Then, in the very week that was supposed to decide everything, one small mistake in an internal summary was blown up as if I had caused a real crisis. I was called in, interrogated, and looked at with disappointment. Then came the polite email, saying the company would be choosing someone more stable during this sensitive period. I carried that humiliation for a long time, believing I had lost because of myself. But that night, I reopened my old inbox. I scrolled through each timestamp and matched them against the dates in the family group chat. My heart was pounding so hard my fingertips went numb. 2 days before things exploded at work, Claire Reed had asked me in the most casual voice, "So what project are you working on these days? Is the promotion basically yours?" At the time, I thought she cared. The next day, Jason Moore messaged me privately to ask if I still used my old work email address, because he said he wanted to send me information about a course. I didn't answer right away, but I still found it strange that he knew so much about the exact moment I was waiting on an internal decision. Then the very next morning, the file with my mistake in it appeared on the desk of someone who should never have seen it that early. I sat there frozen. The most painful part wasn't discovering that something was off. The most painful part was realizing I had spent years calling it bad luck. I had stood in front of a mirror and told myself, "You ruined this, Harper. Don't blame anyone else." I had taken all the guilt so obediently, as if blaming myself was the only way to preserve some image of my family as decent people in my memory. Looking back now, I felt both furious and ashamed. They didn't need to do anything dramatic to destroy me. They only needed to know where I was trying to stand again, then give the slightest shove right where my knees were already shaking. As I dug deeper, two names started appearing too often to ignore. Logan Baker was always around at family meals before every period when my life started falling apart, sitting quietly, speaking little, nodding like a man who wasn't taking sides. But now that neutrality made my skin crawl, he was the one who liked to ask questions that sounded perfectly ordinary. Is work going well these days? Is your new boss difficult? Your department is pretty competitive right now, isn't it? I used to think it was just the polite interest of an older relative. Now I wasn't so sure. Jason Moore was different. He wasn't quiet. He laughed, mocked, and always played the guy who made jokes to keep things light. But he knew too much. He knew where I had submitted applications, who I was under pressure with, and when my evaluations were coming up. There were things I had never said at the dinner table, and yet he would bring them up in that half-joking, half-careless tone, as he had merely overheard them somewhere. Before, I told myself I was paranoid if I suspected family. Now I understand that for years, I hadn't been paranoid at all. I had just been taught to dismiss my own instincts. Then I found the thing that made my whole body go cold. Buried among the screenshots pulled from the very beginning of that group was one older than everything else I had read. It was the opening exchange, the day that chat was created, not to share family updates, not to stay in touch. Claire Reed wrote the first line. Make a separate group. Talking about Harper in the main one is such a hassle. If she reads it, she'll just play the victim. I stared at that line for a long time. Claire Reed hadn't just joined in. She had lit the first match. She was the one who turned me into a permanent topic, into a form of entertainment, with history, with structure, with allies. I remembered all the times she had put an arm around my shoulders in front of everyone, asked after me gently, told me not to put too much pressure on myself, then turned around and talked about me like I was a story, meant to amuse people. I set my phone down and took a very deep breath, but this time, I didn't cry. If Claire Reed was the one who opened the first door, then I would start with her. And I knew that whatever I was about to dig up would be far worse than a group chat mocking me behind my back. I arrived at dinner that night 10 minutes earlier than usual. I did it on purpose, so I'd have enough time to watch each person walk in, to see how they met my eyes and then looked away, which smiles were tighter than usual, whose voice rose half a note from nerves. The kitchen was still bright, the smell of food still familiar, the plates still set out neatly as if nothing filthy had ever seeped into the middle of this thing we called family. That normalcy chilled me more than any shouting match could have. Claire Reed was the first to ask, in that syrupy voice of hers, how work had been lately, as if she genuinely cared. Jason Moore pulled out a chair and sat down with a faint, dismissive laugh, and Samuel King poured himself water without looking me in the face. Declan Davis arrived last, resting a hand lightly on the back of my chair for the briefest moment, as if to let me know he was here. I didn't turn around. Tonight, I didn't need another half-hearted gesture. I didn't flip the table right away. I let them keep performing that warm, close family act they wore so easily. I brought up a few old stories, mentioned the time I bombed an important interview, brought up the period when I moved out without a word, then said almost casually that lately I'd been thinking a lot about the days when I hit bottom. Claire answered too quickly, saying everyone has bad periods. Jason immediately jumped in and said I should let the past go if I wanted a lighter life. Samuel stayed silent, but his hand tightened around his glass so hard his knuckles turned white. I looked at each of them, then asked lightly, "Funny, isn't it? How all of you remember my failures more clearly than I do." The table stalled for one short beat. Claire laughed first, that familiar mocking laugh she always used whenever she wanted to paint someone else as too sensitive. "Harper, if you're starting that thing again where you imagine the whole family is against you, that's exhausting. Everyone has their own life. No one has enough free time to sit around tracking your every move." I nodded, as if that sounded reasonable. Then I turned to Jason. "What about you? Weren't you too busy to text? Just let Harper mess it up one more time?" The smile vanished from Jason's face. He glanced at Claire, then at Samuel, quick enough to be instinctive, but not so quick that I missed it, the reflex of someone whose name had just been called exactly right. "What are you talking about?" I'm repeating exactly what you wrote. Claire sat up straighter. Did you sneak around reading something and twist it into the worst possible interpretation? I looked at her, this time without looking away. No, Claire. I read it very clearly. Clearly enough to remember every period, and the thing that disgusted me most wasn't the wording. It was the way all of you turned my pain into entertainment. Samuel set his glass down on the table a little too hard. That's enough, Harper. You're blowing this out of proportion at a family dinner. I laughed, but the sound of it was so dry, it startled even me. What family, Samuel? Is family the place where people wait for each other to get back up? Or the place where they celebrate when someone falls? No one answered. The air thickened, heavy, as if someone had just sealed every window shut. I turned to Declan just as he spoke, his voice low and carefully controlled. Harper, I know you're hurt, but this isn't the way. If you want to talk, we can talk in private. I turned fully toward him. Talk in private for what, Declan? So you can keep saving their dignity? That's not what I said. Then what are you saying? How long have you known? Declan was silent for one beat. Just one, and it was enough to make my chest tighten. I didn't know everything. But you knew some of it. I drove the words at him like a blade. What did you read? How much did you see of them laughing at me? And why are you still sitting here as if you're somewhere in the middle, as if this is something you can stay neutral about? Claire cut in, her voice suddenly sharp. Don't drag Declan into this. He's always the one stuck cleaning up your emotional messes. I whipped back toward her. At least today, no one's going to clean up yours. I unlocked my phone and set it in the middle of the table. One screenshot came up, then a second, then the recording I had listened to so many times. I knew every breath in it by heart. Samuel's voice filled the room, quiet, but unmistakable in the dead silence. Claire's came next, calm in a way that felt cruel. Jason's laughter cut in between them. Every timestamp, every word, every moment they referred to me in that half-pitying, half-delighted tone, I dragged all of it into the light. I want to hear it again from your own mouths, I said, my voice shaking but not weak. When I lost my job, who was it that said finally something worth watching had happened? When I went through my breakup, who texted that at least Harper had given the family something new to talk about? When I was falling apart badly enough to need therapy, who said I always knew how to make myself the victim? Jason slammed his hand down on the table first. Fine, we texted. So what? We were joking. Joking? I looked straight at him. A joke is supposed to be funny to everyone. I don't find it funny. Claire flushed, but she still tried to keep her voice cold. You turn everything into a tragedy. We're tired of having to revolve around you. No, I said, every word clear. You all like revolving around my failures, because that way you never have to look at your own jealousy, pettiness, and cruelty. Samuel shoved back his chair and stood up so suddenly that it scraped hard against the floor. I thought he was about to shout, but before he could say a word, another sound cut through everything. Natalie Wright, who had been silent since the beginning of dinner, placed her hand on the table. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make everyone turn. She looked at each of them in turn, then at me. Her voice was low and slow, calm in an almost frightening way. Harper is not the one who has just found out, she said. She's only just found out part of it. I've known about this for longer than any of you think. The entire table went dead silent. The room didn't truly shift until Natalie Wright walked in. She didn't raise her voice, and she didn't rush to ask who was right or wrong. She pulled out a chair, sat at the head of the table, set her old leather bag beside her hand, and looked slowly around at all of us. Her gaze wasn't heavy, but it was enough to silence the people who had still been trying to argue. I had thought, even if only in some very small corner of myself, that she might say something about keeping the peace, that families should give each other a little grace. But her first sentence wiped out that hope for anyone still waiting to be protected. She said the thing that disappointed her most was not one cruel remark spoken in anger. The thing that disgusted her was that so many grown adults in one family had used a young woman's pain to draw closer to each other. She spoke slowly, each word so clear no one could pretend they had heard her wrong. She didn't call it a misunderstanding, and she didn't call it joking around. She called it exactly what it was: organized cruelty. I saw Claire Reed freeze, her lips pressing into a thin line. Jason Moore leaned back, trying to look unaffected, but his hand had tightened so hard around his water glass that his knuckles had gone white. Samuel King stared down at the table, as if the wood grain had suddenly become more interesting than anything happening around him. Natalie didn't look at me to comfort me. Strangely, that was exactly what made me feel protected. She didn't turn me into someone who needed soothing. She put me back where I belonged, as someone who had been treated badly and deserved to have the truth spoken aloud. She turned to Claire first and asked, very softly, how empty a grown woman had to be to feel lighter by watching her own niece bend and break. Claire had barely started to open her mouth when Natalie cut her off with something even colder, telling her not to insult her intelligence with late, flimsy excuses. Then she said the thing that made the entire table go still. She had been in that group chat. I turned fully toward her. Not just me, almost everyone reacted, only with different degrees of shock. Claire went visibly pale. Jason kept blinking. Declan Davis sat beside me in silence, but I could feel the tension locking through his shoulders. Natalie said she had been added to the group a long time ago. At first, she had thought it was just a place where the family shared updates, checked in when someone was sick, or passed along news. But the more she read, the more she realized they were not gathering to support one another. They were gathering to judge, to mock, to pick up each of my failures and display them like trophies. Some people spoke about me, in a voice coated with fake concern. Some exaggerated things to make the story more entertaining. Some stayed quiet but stayed long enough to show they agreed. She said she had left the group not because she was weak-hearted, but because she did not want her presence to become an excuse for those people to think she accepted what they were doing. From that point on, she had watched quietly. The way she said it quietly made my heart start pounding. I understood immediately that she knew more than what I had dug out of those screenshots. She knew things beyond words. She knew which hands had reached into my life while I was still busy blaming myself for not being good enough. No one dared interrupt her anymore. Natalie let her eyes move from one person to the next, this time lingering longer on Jason before sliding over to Claire. She said there had come a point when this stopped being mean talk for the sake of venting. Someone in this family had deliberately pushed it further, interfered with my work, twisted the way other people saw me, cut off my ways back, and then stood at a distance to watch me stumble. Every word she dropped into the room felt like a hook ripping away the last layer of disguise. I heard myself take a deep breath. In my mind flashed the anonymous letter sent to my old company, the false rumors that somehow reached clients, the partnership opportunity that was canceled just hours before I was supposed to sign. I had thought my life had been unbelievably unlucky. But now, hearing Natalie say it in a voice as firm as hammered nails, I felt cold spread down my spine. Someone at this table had not only laughed at my failures, they had helped create them. Natalie slowly opened the leather bag and took out an old envelope, yellowed at the edges. She placed it in the center of the table. The sound of paper touching wood was small, but Claire flinched as if she had heard an explosion. Jason sat up immediately. I stared at that envelope with the feeling that I had been locked in darkness for months, and now someone was standing right in front of me holding the key. She rested her fingertips on the envelope, her eyes never leaving the faces across from her. Then she said, in a voice so calm it was terrifying, "It's time for someone to stop pretending they're innocent." No one said a word when Natalie pulled the envelope from her bag. The soft rustle of paper was barely audible, and yet in that room it sounded like a blade slicing straight through the last layer of pretense. She set each stack of documents on the table one by one, not throwing them down, not shoving them forward, not bothering to perform outrage. It was her calmness that made everyone start to be afraid. I looked at the first printout, and it felt like someone had closed a fist around my heart. It was an email Claire Reed had sent to an old contact in the media industry, someone who had once promised to recommend me for an editorial position I had been waiting on for months. In the email, Claire wrote in a tone so gentle it was sickening, saying she was just worried about Harper, that my mental state had been unstable lately, that I was unlikely to function well long-term under pressure. Below that were screenshots of text messages, private things I had said during moments of weakness, clipped at exactly the most damaging angles. I looked up at Claire. She had gone pale, but she still tried to keep that familiar soft voice as she asked Natalie where she had gotten those. I laughed, a dry, brittle sound, so strange even I barely recognized it. Your first reaction wasn't that you didn't do it, it was asking where she got it. That tells me everything. Claire turned to me, eyes bright with panic now that she'd been cornered. She said she had only been worried I wouldn't be able to handle the pressure, that she was afraid I'd walk into a wider environment and collapse all over again. It made me feel sick. The person who hurt me most was the one who knew exactly how hard it had been for me to get back on my feet. Claire knew about the months I couldn't sleep, knew about the times I sat in my car without the courage to open the door and go inside. Knew the thing I feared most was being seen as a failure. She knew all of it, and then laid those very things out like merchandise, trading them in for the feeling of standing one step above me. Natalie didn't let Claire steer the room toward pity. She pulled out several more sheets and pushed them toward the center of the table. There were call logs, timestamps for when screenshots had been sent, and short exchanges between Claire and someone else. Natalie said Claire could never have been that precise unless someone on the inside had been feeding her information. I hadn't even fully processed what that meant before Natalie turned and looked directly at Jason Moore. The air in the room froze. Jason jerked still in his chair, his hand tightening around his water glass until his knuckles went white. Natalie read through the details slowly, coldly. Jason was the one who told Claire when I submitted job applications, when I had just gone through a breakup, when I was panicking about rent, and even that I had started seeing a therapist, something I had told only a very small number of people I trusted. He didn't have to invent anything dramatic. All he had to do was gather up the truest fragments of my life, hand them to Claire, and let her choose the perfect moment to drive the knife in. I turned to Jason and saw that he was still getting ready to make excuses. He said he had only casually mentioned a few family matters, that everyone was worried about me, and that was why people talked. I cut him off. You were worried about me, so you handed my private life to someone else like a gift? Is that what you call concern? Or did you just enjoy having something new to tell every time I fell apart? Jason looked at me, then around the table as if hoping someone would step in for him. No one did. Claire's voice started to shake as she said Jason had been the one to tell her things first, that she had only listened. Jason immediately spun on her, cursing back that Claire was the one who pushed him to take screenshots, pushed him to save every detail because, sooner or later, it'll be useful. The two of them tore into each other right there in front of the whole family. And the alliance that had humiliated me for so long fell apart under nothing more than a few sheets of paper. I thought that was the bottom of the truth. Then Declan Davis spoke. His voice was rough and low, enough to make the entire table go still. He said he knew the chat existed. He had been in it for a while, not because he joined in, but because he wanted to watch it, because he thought that if things went too far, he would step in. By the time he finished, my whole body had gone cold. The anger in me didn't explode right away. It settled into something quieter and much sharper. I looked straight at him. You were in there. You read all of it. You saw them celebrate when I failed, saw them twist every piece of my life, and you chose to stand there and watch. How is that any different? Declan set his jaw and said he had wanted many times to pull me out of it, but the longer it went on, the more tangled everything became. He was afraid that if he told me without proof, they would turn it back on me and paint me as the one causing drama. I nodded, slowly enough that my own calm hurt. So instead, you let me keep walking into rooms with these people. You let me sit at the same table, smile at them, while you knew exactly what they'd been doing behind my back. Declan had no answer. His silence in that moment was worse than any excuse he could have made. I used to think being hated was the deepest kind of pain. Now I knew it hurt even more when someone who understood everything still chose silence. Natalie rested her hand on the final stack of papers, her gaze moving from Claire to Jason and then stopping on me. Her voice wasn't loud, but every word sent a chill down my spine. Not yet, Harper. The person who has disappointed me most still isn't Claire or Jason. The whole room went dead silent. I turned to look at each person around the table, and for the first time, I saw that Samuel King and Logan Baker could no longer keep their composure. I kept thinking that, after Claire's emails and the messages Jason had set in motion, there was nothing left in that room to strip bare. But Natalie still hadn't folded the stack of papers away. She placed one hand on the table, looked at Logan Baker, then let her gaze rest on Samuel King a beat longer. Her voice stayed calm, and that only made every word sound colder than a shout. Claire and Jason lit the match. But fire doesn't spread on its own unless someone opens the door and lets it keep moving. Logan frowned and let out a strained little laugh, as if he'd been dragged into something that had nothing to do with him. Samuel kept his head down, both hands clenched so tightly his knuckles had gone white. I turned to look at them, and all at once I remembered every time I had walked into a room and felt the way people looked at me had already changed before I even spoke. I had spent so long wondering why my failures came so fast and lingered so long, as if someone was always telling my story before I ever got the chance to introduce myself. Natalie pulled out a few more sheets. She said Logan had once told a business associate that I was unstable, that putting work in my hands was a risk. She said Samuel had repeated to people on the community board that I made everything bigger than it was, that every time I stumbled, I turned it into a tragedy. Neither of them had invented the first cruel sentence. They had simply picked up the poison from the family group chat, dressed it up to sound objective, and carried it outside, as if it were a fair assessment. I looked at Logan. So that's how it worked. You didn't have to insult me to my face. You just had to say the right thing to the right person at the right time, then stand back and watch me wonder why every door kept closing. Logan looked up, his face burning red. Harper, I was only repeating what I heard. I had no idea it would go this far. I laughed, but my throat was tight. That's the worst part. People like you always think you're innocent because you weren't the one holding the knife, when really, you're the one who placed it in the hand that needed it. Samuel finally lifted his head. I didn't think those comments would have consequences like this. Because you weren't the one who had to live with them, I said flatly. I'm the one who lost opportunities. I'm the one who got branded unstable, hard to work with, always one step from falling apart. You lost a few seconds repeating something for the sake of hearing yourself say it. I lost far more than that. Even to me, my own voice sounded unfamiliar. It didn't shake anymore. It didn't break apart halfway through the way it always had before. I pulled my phone closer, opened each screenshot, and read out the dates, the names of senders, and the names of recipients. I named the editorial role I had been cut from, the freelance contract that had been delayed, even the fundraiser where a woman had looked at me with careful suspicion and gently asked whether I was stable enough for a long-term project. Every point in time connected back to a message, an email, a supposedly careless comment from my own family's group chat. Then I set my phone down. Let me say this once, clearly. Family is not a license for cruelty. Blood is not a shelter for cowardice. You all sat there and watched me break, and every time I fell, you applauded. That is not a misunderstanding anymore. That is a choice. No one cut in. Claire had gone pale. Jason sat frozen. Logan turned his face away. Samuel pressed his lips together, and no longer had the nerve to look at me again. Natalie gave the slightest nod, as if she had been waiting for that exact moment all evening. Then she spoke, slowly and decisively, and said that starting today, she would be changing everything this family had always taken for granted as a right. Anyone who had used my pain for entertainment, for leverage, or to build a decent image of themselves would no longer be trusted to handle anything personal on her behalf. Logan would no longer remain the named representative in the land deal she had planned to hand to him. Samuel was being removed from the family fund he had assumed he would certainly manage. Claire and Jason would lose access to the support she had quietly shared out every year. More importantly, she made it clear in front of everyone that once trust was gone, no perfectly timed apology could demand it back. The room went so quiet I could hear someone swallow. For the first time, the people who had once treated me like a joke had to sit there and taste what it felt like to lose something they had always assumed belonged to them. Dinner ended in a silence so heavy it felt physical. No one had enough pride left to ask me to stay. I stepped out into the back hallway to breathe, my hands still ice cold even though the shaking inside me had started to settle. I thought the night had already reached its peak, that all that remained now was the wreckage to clean up. Then I heard footsteps behind me. Declan Davis stood in the doorway, not coming too close. His face looked nothing like the silent, evasive mask he had worn for days, as if he had finally reached the point where he could not keep hiding it. He looked at me for a long moment, then said in a low, rough voice, "Harper, there's something about your mother and Natalie Wright that I've known for a long time. That's why I behaved so badly. I turned so fast it hurt." That one sentence alone was enough to send a cold through my entire spine. The moment Declan mentioned my mother, I went completely still, because I understood at once that this story was nowhere near over. It had just reached into a wound far older than any of this. After Natalie finished speaking, the silence in the room was no longer empty. It had shape, it had weight, as if it were pressing down on every chest in the room. I looked at those familiar faces and, for the first time, understood that some people do not deserve to be called a source of comfort just because they share your blood. I thought everything had already been dragged into the light, until Declan stepped forward, his voice rough, as if even he knew what he was about to say would sever the last remaining thread between us. He said he had known part of the truth for a long time, not about the group chat, but about my mother and Natalie. Years ago, when my mother was still alive, she had borrowed a very large sum from Natalie to save a business that was collapsing. Natalie agreed, but in exchange, my mother had to promise to cut off contact with a man who had once threatened to expose an old family secret. That man was not an ex-lover, and he was not a business partner. He was someone who held documents that could have cracked the family's reputation wide open, because they pointed to Logan using his connections to force another person out of a position, clearing the way for my mother to get back on her feet. My mother knew about it. She stayed silent, accepted the help, and carried that sense of debt with her until the day she died. Declan had learned the story by accident, after overhearing Natalie and my mother arguing in the hospital. He said that when I first started suspecting the family, he had wanted to tell me, but everything looked too tangled, too easy to blow apart. He chose silence, thinking that if he could block a few attacks, contain a few rumors, things would never spiral this far. He said he had stopped Jason a few times, warned Claire, and tried to pull Samuel back. But he had done all of it in the dark, behind my back, as if I were the last person who needed to know the truth about my own life. I looked at him for a long time before I finally asked, my voice so calm it sounded cold. Did you think you were protecting me, or were you just protecting the kind of order that made things easier for you? Declan did not answer right away. This silence from him said more than any confession could have. I understood that he had reasons, fears, even a part of his conscience that was not completely rotten. But he had no right to trade my truth for his own sense of peace. Some people betray you with cruelty. Some betray you through hesitation. In the end, the pain they cause hurts the same. Natalie sat down slowly. She did not defend anyone. She only said, her voice low and tired, that she too had once believed silence was how you protected a family. She kept Logan's actions hidden, covered up my mother's bad choices, and told herself that if she let everything sleep, the house would stay standing. But the truth does not sleep. It rots in the dark, then turns into a habit of covering for one another, into cowardice renamed sacrifice, into fertile ground where Claire, Jason, and Samuel could plant their cruelty without anyone stopping it from the start. I listened to all of it. I understood much more, but I did not feel any lighter. Understanding does not make a wound disappear. It only helps you stop asking why everything became so twisted. I turned to each of them. Claire broke into tears. Jason stared at the floor. Samuel could not bring himself to look at me, and Logan sat motionless as a shadow dragged out of hiding. Declan stood there too, the closest to me, and somehow the farthest away. I made myself clear, speaking slowly, sentence by sentence, that from this day on, tears, late apologies, and the title of family would no longer be a ticket into my life. Claire, Jason, and Samuel were not allowed to contact me until they were willing to publicly face what they had done. Logan no longer had any right to interfere in any decision involving me. If Declan wanted to remain in my life, he would have to start from nearly zero, not with promises, but with time, truth, and accountability. As for me, I would not choose revenge so extreme that it stained me too, but I would not force myself to forgive just to look noble. Natalie did exactly what she had promised before. She cut off the financial influence of the people who had used the family as a shield. She sent letters of apology to those who had been affected by the lies told about me. She did not do it to salvage anyone's image, but to restore the final sense of fairness I should have had long ago. When I walked out of that house, I did not feel like a winner. I felt like someone who had just made it through the wreckage and finally recovered her own voice. Betrayal inside a family hurts more than any fall in the outside world because it strikes the very place you once believed was safest. But it was also from that same ruined place that I learned something no one could ever take from me again. If there is one voice that must be protected first, it has to be mine. And for the first time in many months, I was no longer more afraid of other people's silence than I was of trusting myself.